Oh boy. Okay. Let's do this. So this is probably one of the few weekly videos that I've been making that was known to be in production ahead of time, and the rabbit hole goes very deep on this one. To give a brief overview at the start, Genshin Impact has had several muted English voice actors since 5.1, primarily consisting of VAs of past characters. The primary reason cited for this was the SAG-AFTRA interactive media strike held in order to secure proper protections against the use of AI to replicate their work. I will have to go deeper on that later, but for now, let's talk about what the situation that triggers this video really is, and that would be the 5.5 update, where voice actor for the character Kenichi, John Patnode, has been replaced by Jacob Takanashi, currently only with new voice lines, but Hoyoverse has stated that older dialogue will be redone in future updates. So, like I said, the rabbit hole goes deep on this one, and to really get into the story properly, I can't have too much of an intro and just have to get started with what needs to be said. One of the parties most directly involved in the SAG-AFTRA strike negotiations is a very relevant player to what I have to say overall, and that would be Formosa Interactive. Now, this isn't the first instance of Genshin Impact's voice acting in particular having issues in relation to Formosa, and to be honest, Formosa's issues as a shitty company go back way further than that. But let's start at Karina Botker, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that last name, tweeted about not being paid for a big project. And she wasn't the only one speaking up, but for the purposes of this video, she's the most notable choice. Markedly, she specifically blames the lack of union status for non-payment, when we would later find out that it was Formosa themselves that were creating the issue here. The fact that the studio, and not the project that's not paying her, is incredibly relevant. And no, the lack of mention of Genshin Impact by name wasn't really convincing anyone that it wasn't Genshin at all before anyone tries to say otherwise. Eventually, Hoyoverse would put out a statement, and while the direct links I could find are broken, I read a post that the full text of what they said here, and it's been spoken of a lot that they took Karina from Formosa to different studio as part of the resolution of this, although I haven't been able to find anything that outright verifies this. Formosa has been replaced as the studio for Genshin voice work as of 5.2, and I can imagine that in reality the only reason it took that long for the change to happen is because of contract limitations. Because I have a hard time believing any company would stay if there wasn't a penalty for moving on, and even then, knowing how far in advance most of Genshin's voice acting is done, it seems likely there was a stage of finding a new studio to work with, and then at least a few updates where work contracted with Formosa was still being used before 5.2. But more important than Formosa, we should be talking about the strike proper a lot more than prior issues with them. With the recent issues relating to Hoyoverse projects, a lot of takes about the strike have come to the surface, and I want to start with one of the ones from the side of the striking actors. All the VAs come back if Hoyoverse just signs the interim agreement. Well, the issue that a lot of people notice is that this would make Hoyoverse a fully unionized project, and while it's easy to make the argument that would be better for the voice actors in general, there are reasons to think that it may not be. See, while the take that non-union voice actors can't take union roles isn't necessarily true, what is true is that non-union actors are limited in taking union work, and part of that involves the intent to join in the union within 30 days, or 3 projects, or 90 days. It tends to vary based on the source. The main argument for why someone wouldn't comes down to dues, although that's not entirely true either, since a lot of actors are what's called FI-core or financial core. They pay dues to the union but aren't actually members. Part of the reason one would do this is being able to be less restricted in the work you take, since union actors cannot take non-union work, which there's just more of. And this is important to note in all this. Although SAG-AFTRA encourages those who are non-union to strike out of solidarity, and you're especially more likely to see that from people who are FI-core, because they clearly have enough interest in the union's success to financially support them without even getting a vote on union activities, no one outside the union, even if they are literally paying dues, is actually required to strike. To me, all of this, it just seems like an overall flaw with the system in general, although one that may very well be a necessity for the system to even work. Of course, this will be the first time I mention a particular Reddit post by Kit Harington, no, not that one, that the reason I may not have screenshots on screen for will be addressed if it's still the case when I edit this on Tuesday later. But I'll relay what his point was there. SAG-AFTRA is run by humans. When it comes to dues, they'll work with you on how to handle that, be it a payment plan or a due date after payment for a project or what have you. However, when discussing this on Blue Sky with me, one of the main talking points that ended up leading me to his Reddit post to begin with actually points out one of the issues with that. Namely, the question of how enforceable any action that's placed into a contract without the power of collective bargaining actually is. But that goes for you with the union too, because a union is more than capable of acting in the better interest of the group at the expense of the individual. Not to mention the history of labor unions in the mob that makes it so easy to make them look bad now, even when they are acting in good faith. If a union decides that you don't get a Taft-Hartley waiver for whatever reason those in the governing body decide on, then what protection do you have there exactly? Probably even less than you have for protections being placed into a non-union contract and then those terms being breached. I'd be willing to bet, because it's not even the law telling them that they have to give you a pass for not joining the club quick enough. So you don't even get to hire your own lawyer for that one. And to make myself clear, I think Taft-Hartley waivers should be handled on a case-by-case basis. That's part of why I said we've got flaws that are necessary for the system to work going on here. But when the whole argument is that the company can't be trusted, even if they put it in the contract that they can't do the thing you don't want them to do, then do you see how someone can look at your counter-argument to concerns with, we'll work with you on that, and give a side-eye in that argument? Look, the fact of the matter is that the way SAG-AFTRA works in the first place is flawed, and quite frankly, if it wasn't, then we probably wouldn't be having this conversation right now, because there would be absolutely no reason for Genshin to be non-union other than maybe if they wanted to hire outside the US for English VAs, and even then, there would probably be provisions that would make that reasonable. That's not to say that I'm against SAG-AFTRA really at all for standing up for what's right, and what they are standing up for is what's right. Do not get that twisted. But you can be in support of someone and still see how they're in the wrong in some way too, because if nothing else, fixing the optics of it can go a long way in helping both garner more support and keep the support that you've got more easily. As a matter of fact, speaking of being willing to say when someone is wrong that you agree with, I want to go back to them changing studios and also cite where I was wrong in my initial reactions to this that resulted in my communication with Kit on the subject in the first place. I actually looked into the new studio, Side Studios, that Hoyo began using for Genshin, and while I initially thought that what I found indicated SAG-AFTRA certification, looking more closely at it, it doesn't necessarily seem to mean anything with the present strike climate, and is probably just buzzwords, and any direct references to AI in relation to Side Studios I can't really find. But there's a simpler way to address this. Formosa is directly a party in the strike negotiation, and Genshin is no longer working with that studio, so in theory, working with a different studio that seems to be advertising itself as at least following the direction of SAG-AFTRA would indicate that the new contracts would probably be non-struck. Well, as pointed out by Kit, it's the project that is struck or unstruck when they sign the agreement, more accurately in this situation, rather than the studio. So changing studios doesn't really matter, at the very least on a paper standpoint. Also, as pointed out by a few other people as well, the studio having such agreements doesn't mean the game's developers would follow the same provisions, which is once again the issue of trust. Although I'd like to note that there are reasons why the public perception is like this that's, based on the actual facts and not misinformation that some people are trying to say it is, even if this is an incorrect assertion. For one, the fact that Formosa is named as a party in negotiations is rather specifically indicative of the fact that the studios really fucking matter in all this. Second of all, We also have the pre-existing issues in relation to Genshin's English voice situation, indicating a contract dispute with Formosa potentially being the reason the voices were muted in the first place, even though in reality it was the strike, and we know that because the voice actors are telling us that's the reason, which is indicated by the person they reportedly pulled out of Formosa still voicing their character. And also the fact that Alejandro Saab, who was on strike during the previous SAG strike, not only isn't striking now and voice actors in literally everything Hoyoverse makes, but actively called out that Formosa doesn't record Genshin anymore.
They are supposed to be negotiating. Formosa has not signed the interim agreement. They have not, but also they don't record Genshin anymore. So, so yeah. So that's not really a thing. Wait, what? Yeah, like just information I got. So.
You know, indicating that it might matter. But, you know, I'm a little bit more familiar with contracts in relation to media rights than your average bear, and the studio signs a contract with the developer too. And they would know that any protective measures for the talent's work provided by you should also be provided against Hoyo. The whole point of lack of trust for someone to agree is related back to collective bargaining, where you have the bigger force behind you against a large company to show them that violation of this contract can be enforced without you having to go into life-ruining levels of debt to fight for what you deserve. It's the reason that unions would also help the non-union workers, because that larger force creates an industry standard that non-union projects are expected to either follow or be much more limited in who's willing to work for them. But that's also something that an audio production company does too, and while it's very possible for them to act with the intent of exploiting talent, and far less likely for a union to exploit an individual for the sake of the overall group, I mean, for one, the fact that paying dues and taking non-union projects appears to provide you with zero backup, and anybody who's FICOR can correct me if that's not the case, indicates that may not necessarily be the case. But for two, they're certainly more likely to be acting in the benefit of the performer than not having a studio working with you at all. Well, it doesn't absolutely mean that the developer is willing to go to the same lengths to protect talent, but has other reasons for not wanting to be a union project. It is, at the very least, an indicator that the protections being stricken for are something that they care about, especially when the other two companies are working with explicitly protected production companies for voice work. There's also what the countries associated with these companies actually think in relation to legal standing with regards to AI usage. For one, I'm struggling to find any country that hasn't ruled that AI-generated work is copyrightable, including the main countries at question in relation to the issue. Singapore, the home of Cognosphere, China, the nation of origin for MiHoYo, and Japan, where Jacob Takanashi lives and works included. This is notable because preventing AI-generated works from being copywritten is the first step to keeping protections for actual artists on the table. Companies are going to care about owning the IP, but if there's no IP to own, then they will be more interested in regulation against the thing that's making the IP unownable. What would be better are laws that explicitly make the use of another person's work, whatever type of work it is, to train an AI model a violation of copyright. And although that wouldn't be entirely realistic, bringing someone to the table in the interest of protecting their rights and not just yours is a good way to find a regulatory middle ground that protects both. So let's go back to laws from these countries again, specifically in relation to deepfakes, which would likely be regulations that would help cover actors having replicant voice models used for them. China is explicitly targeting deepfakes with regulations. Singapore is also taking action against deepfakes, although concerningly, some of that is a little bit on the weaker end, and Japan's are probably the weakest, with only copyright protection. While Japan is the country of these three that is probably the least relevant to this, the fact that no overt anti-impersonation legal precedent is on the books, to my knowledge, for Japan, for the country the voice actor in question was hired from, weakens the indications that Hoyoverse is against the practice. But again, The fact that China and Singapore are coming out more strongly against this indicates much more strongly that they don't. When you take all the evidence together, it seems to me that their stance is, indicative of art coming over profit in a situation like this. This is part of the reason I think a lot of people aren't really looking at some of the voice actors the same way. But, well, let's talk about that. At the very least, some of it. Right, so now we get to directly talk about the new VA for a moment. Jacob Takanashi's announcement saying that he was proud to take the role was, needless to say, not met well. Which is understandable, because on the surface it looks like he's a scab. But remember, he lives in Japan, and according to Nathan Noakes, Roran's voice actor, he didn't know about the strike, which some people view with skepticism. And I'll first explain the good reason to be skeptical here, before going into why people are actually calling it sus. The good reason is that Nathan is also working on the game in current updates. So there are those that could argue that he is also a scab, although not in the same way, since he's not taking work that previously belonged to another actor, which is the real reason that Jacob's more perceived as crossing the picket line than anyone else in this. He's a replacement, not playing someone new. That brings up something important about this whole situation that I'm not really sure where else in this video to put. So I kind of just had to put it here. The other reason that people are citing, and this is the stupid one, is that because Jacob has made tweets before saying AI was bad and conversations about contracts he had with another VA. That doesn't mean he knew about the strike. Just because he agreed with things that are the reason doesn't mean he knows why those things are being talked about. And by the way, just because you have conversations with someone between work, that doesn't mean that you're talking about a strike. Just saying. And some of these things against Jacob are coming directly from the voice actors, straight up calling him a liar. Look, getting mad about this is one thing. But for one, I don't think it should be Jacob for taking a role when he's saying he didn't know, but rather Hoyoverse more so than that. Now, I'll be fair to them and say that John Patinode's statement for why he was recast may be accurate to his side, but not necessarily accurate to Hoyo's side. Their reasons may be different, but if the strike is the reason, then it's scummy as hell, and if it's not, then Hoyoverse should probably be making some kind of statement on the matter. But I'm not going to get mad at Jacob for taking a role, especially if he didn't know he was getting the opportunity because of a strike in the first place. That more so falls on either Hoyoverse or his agent, and if I were him, I would be talking to his agent about this backlash. That doesn't mean that the backlash is necessarily warranted, though, in the degree that it's being given. A lot of voice actors, like I said, who were mad at him are those who are striking, and some are being very respectful even if they don't like the situation. Because, to be honest, there's too little to point a finger at someone and cancel them for it. But then there's a couple actors who aren't on strike speaking up. To be clear, there's very much a difference of perception when it comes to taking a role when you're replacing someone else, rather than when it's a new character entirely. I mentioned this earlier in the video. Because you're ostensibly taking that role from someone who's fighting for their protections. Even if there are reasons, you still feel protected. So, let's talk for a moment about who started this hate train against Jacob, shall we? Hi, Karina. Yeah, I'm mad. I'm fucking mad. Your tweet's on screen. I will say, you are right. This was not a passing of the torch. But that's not the part that's actually bothering me. It's the "you are no castmate of mine" part. If Kaylee Mills, Shar Kirby, if they said this, I would understand. Yeah, they're striking, and Jacob's replacing a colleague that is striking with them. Karina in particular, who has very good reasons for continuing to voice Paimon, by the way, and what I say in no way discredits that, especially since, even according to SAG-AFTRA, if you need the money and are non-union, you're fine. And they should absolutely not be the one to say that he's not a castmate when they call themselves a scab. And that's what pisses me off. Almost as much as when you say that YouTubers inherently don't know what's going on in the industry because we're not in it, even though SAG-AFTRA also encompasses influencers as well. Yes, Karina, YouTubers. can be part of SAG-AFTRA, even if the only work we do is on our YouTube channels. There's a thing called an influencer agreement. Look it up. And also using that blanket statement is pretty fucking offensive to the guy finding out about this and making a video on the subject where he isn't 100% on the side of SAG-AFTRA on this one, while still understanding exactly why they are doing what they're doing and supporting the end result of what they want in terms of AI protection. Since his entire YouTube channel is built on what is essentially a self-written, directed, produced, scored, published, and, yes, Karina, acted project. I am your peer, whether you like it or not, and if you educated me or spoke to me with the civility that I'm showing you, or some of your peers are showing me, when we have disagreements on aspects of this, instead of talking down to me, then it would piss me off a lot less. But you know what actually pisses me off way more than that? The death threats. Yeah, that's right, we're getting that too. I haven't personally seen any reporting on death threats against Jacob Takanashi, but Karina themselves has come out against it, so I'll give credit there. And, of course, we have people who were speaking negatively about Jacob taking the role, locking their accounts because of it, too. Jacob, while trying to say that people shouldn't be sending that kind of shit, was, well, just take a look at what Little Karibo says in response to that. I'm sorry, but that's fucking cold-blooded. You're basically saying the death threats are directly his fault here, but then just putting "with respect" at the beginning, like you're not about to hold his feet over the fire for existing.
You can't just say "with all due respect" and then say something insulting like that.
Especially when he's told someone in this community that he doesn't know and is being called a liar automatically by other VAs, some of whom do present their reasons for thinking he's lying, don't get me wrong, but others are just going, voice actors talk to each other, of course you did. All I'm saying is that as someone who's seen evidence to be able to provide that someone knew something they claimed not to very easily, it's really weird that the counter argument to him not knowing that John Patnode was being replaced because of the strike, or at the very least, even proof that he knew the strike existed, is word of mouth hearsay and not even a screenshot of a text message. And I have to come back to why I don't have screenshots of the Kit Harington Reddit post, by the way. Because it apparently was put under moderation review at the point I wrote the script on the Genshin Impact subreddit on Sunday. And if this is still in here, it has not been restored as of Tuesday morning. Which begs the question, ¿por qué? I didn't see him saying anything hateful in the original post by Kit, and the thread is still there as of now. I'll link it in the description even. All he does is attempt to explain his side civilly, and moderating that part of the discussion really seems to me like the same kind of shady behavior a lot of people are accusing SAG-AFTRA of. Oh, and don't get me started about the ones who are saying that it's about not using AI at all, because SAG-AFTRA is actually working with AI companies like Ethovox on regulations in relation to voice model replicas. So they're not exactly against the existence of it wholesale like you are. They just want to still let people have work while reducing the workload on minor roles that will actually probably push more small VAs out. But the point being that they are willing to embrace AI's use in general, even if they want to make sure that the work is still there in the future. To be honest, I think there are very few people who are objectively right in this situation. The people who are the most wrong are incredibly easy to spot. It's anyone who's sending death threats over mouth sounds for the funny spinny man. Below that, you've got the people who are actually receiving most of the death threats that I found, because, especially Karina, because while I understand their anger very well, I do think some of these posts border on inciting that type of behavior. But that doesn't mean that they deserve to get that behavior themselves. Next, Hoyoverse. I don't know everything about the way union and non-union contracts works. I'm going to be perfectly honest on that front. And I think the fact that you can't know enough about all this without being on the inside is very sketchy. But I also don't think recasting an actor who's on strike is cool unless there's more to the story that I just don't know. Next, you have Jacob himself. He didn't do enough due diligence to know what was going on, and that's minor in comparison to active maliciousness, but it's still either his bad or his agents, if not both. Next, we have SAG-AFTRA, who, if anything is being done wrong, I at least understand why those things are necessary for the right thing to happen. But then there's the one person who just plain is the victim in all this. And that's John Patnode. He stood by those who were fighting for what's right. He accepted the consequences of it, even when those consequences were not necessarily just. And you know what he hasn't done? Gone after anyone with the kind of vitriol a lot of the community on either side of this is displaying. Instead of my usual outro, I'm going to do things a little bit different because, to be honest, I feel like encouraging people to debate in the comments with something like this is going to spill over in the exact kind of thing I said was the worst about the whole situation, even if making this video at all is probably going to get that to happen anyway. But I would like to say a couple of more things. For one, I'd like to give a shout out to Kit Harington, who was willing to be civil with me when I was trying to understand a few more of the intricacies of the situation. And if more people could do things the way he was doing, then this whole thing would be a whole lot better for everyone. I'd also like to encourage everyone to support the actors that are striking as well as they can. And honestly, pressure these companies about their stances on the ethics of AI usage for their games. Even if they have reasons for remaining non-union, but support the provisions and protections that will ensure voice acting remains a valuable art form, they should still be expected to put their stance into the public directly so that they can be held to that standard in the public eye. The thing that caused all of this is focusing on the wrong aspects of what really matters in this fight. And that's for the companies themselves to listen. So the best thing that you can do is make your voice heard. Not about a recasting, not about an interim agreement, but about the actual issues that are in the interim agreement. Because that is how you open the door. Talk about the thing you want, not the piece of paper that it's written on.